strongest men don't break in the places you'd expect. They break in the places they never thought to protect. Not under pressure from enemies. Not under the weight of failure or loss or the world's ordinary brutality. They break in the quiet, inside relationships they chose, with women they loved, in the particular privacy of a connection that slowly, methodically, and without a single visible wound, took everything they had built. This is the destruction that leaves no marks. No raised voice. No courtroom evidence. No moment anyone could point to and say, that's when it started. Because it didn't start in a moment. It started in a pattern. A cycle of warmth and withdrawal so precisely timed that a man who could withstand anything the world threw at him gradually lost track of the version of himself that walked into the relationship. He was composed when she met him. Grounded. The kind of man who didn't need external validation to feel settled. Who had built his confidence from the inside out through years of discipline, failure, and the quiet accumulation of things he had chosen to become. That version of him was what she was drawn to. It was also the version the dynamic consumed first. Picture a man who used to sit in silence comfortably, who could enter a room and not need to fill it, who could disagree without anxiety, who had a relationship with his own judgment that no one else could easily override. Now he is replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, checking for the thing he said that caused the shift. He is not sure what the shift was. He is not sure there was a shift. He is not sure of anything he was once completely certain of. The most sophisticated dismantling of a man doesn't touch his body. Touches his certainty. This video names the mechanism. Precisely, without comfort. What follows will be the most important thing you hear about how capable men lose themselves, and why their strength was the first thing used against them. You are not imagining it. That deserves to be said clearly and first. The confusion you feel, the particular disorientation of a man who has never had difficulty trusting his own judgment, now genuinely uncertain whether his perception of events is accurate, that confusion was not self-generated. It was installed, carefully, incrementally, through a dynamic so subtle that naming it feels like an accusation rather than a description. The pattern is consistent. When he was grounded, she tested his edges. When he was composed, she found the specific emotional frequency that reached him. When he was clear, she introduced doubt not through argument, but through the particular reframing of his behavior that made him question whether what he intended and what she experienced were the same thing. They never were, according to her account. His calm was indifference. His silence was cruelty. His patience was passivity. His need for space was abandonment. Every strength he possessed was reinterpreted as a failure in the language of her emotional experience, and because he was a man who took responsibility seriously, he absorbed the reinterpretations. He adjusted. He worked to become less of the things she said hurt her. And in working to become less of them, he became less of himself. A man sits with a version of himself that he barely recognizes. He used to train with a clarity of purpose that was almost meditative. Now he goes through the motions, his mind somewhere in the aftermath of a conversation that shouldn't have gotten to him but did. He used to have opinions he stated plainly. Now he edits them before they arrive, running them through an internal filter that didn't exist 18 months ago. He didn't lose his strength in a fight. He lost it in the slow, reasonable process of being told that his strength was the problem. The brutal contrast. The world tested him and he passed. She tested him in a different direction entirely, not toward his resistance, but toward his willingness to question himself. And he was not prepared for that test. No one told him it was coming. Understanding how the erosion actually operates, the specific mechanism beneath the confusion, is where this changes. The mechanism has a clinical name, covert invalidation, and it operates with a precision that makes it almost impossible to defend against in real time. It does not work through aggression or accusation. It works through the gradual, persistent reframing of a man's perception of his own behavior, specifically by locating the gap between his intention and her experience and making that gap his fault to close, indefinitely, regardless of how many adjustments he makes. Here is how it functions. He does something. He has a clear understanding of why he did it, what it meant, what it was designed to communicate. She responds not to what he did, but to a reframed version of it. A version that has traveled through the filter of her emotional state and arrived carrying a meaning he never intended. He explains his actual intention. She tells him that his intention doesn't change her experience. He accepts this because he is a responsible man and he knows that impact and intent are different things. He adjusts. The next version of himself does something slightly different, having adjusted. She reframes that too. The cycle continues. Each iteration requires more of him and produces less certainty about whether the version he is becoming is closer to or further from the man he was trying to be. This is the mechanism, the perpetual closing of a gap that is never actually closed, because the gap is not a product of his behavior, it is a feature of the dynamic. Contrast this with how the world tests a strong man. External pressure is direct. It announces itself. He can brace, resist, adapt. The covert invalidation dynamic is the opposite. It arrives dressed as communication, as vulnerability, as the reasonable request of someone who feels hurt. His strength has no useful application. His patience, his willingness to take responsibility, his emotional intelligence, all of it becomes fuel for the erosion rather than defense against it. Picture a man who spent a decade building the capacity to not be moved by external chaos. He is moved now by a look across a dinner table. Not because he became weaker, because the attack was never aimed at his resistance. It was aimed at his self-trust. When a man stops trusting his own perception, the strongest architecture in him becomes a building without a foundation. What this looks like in the lived, daily texture of a relationship across months and years is next, and it is difficult to see from the inside. It never arrives as a single devastating blow. It arrives as 100 small adjustments, each one reasonable in isolation, catastrophic in accumulation. He says something direct, the way he always used to speak, without rehearsal, without management. She responds with a hurt he didn't intend. He explains. She tells him that explaining is defensive. He stops explaining. Now his silence is interpreted as indifference. He finds the middle ground, acknowledgement without defense. She tells him he's not really hearing her. He listens more carefully. She tells him he's performing listening. He genuinely tries to understand what she needs. He is now spending more cognitive energy managing her experience of his communication than he is actually communicating. The man who used to speak plainly has become a man who edits, monitors, recalibrates, and still gets it wrong. It shows up in his body before it shows up in his words. He used to enter a room with a settled energy. Now he reads the atmosphere before he commits to it. He checks her posture, her tone, the quality of her silence before he decides how to be. He has become, without noticing the transition, a man who uses her emotional state as the primary indicator of whether he is safe to be himself. The man who once needed no external confirmation now runs every version of himself through her silent approval process before it leaves his mouth. It shows up in conflict with a specific, recognizable signature. He states a position. She responds with pain rather than disagreement. He cannot argue with her pain. He is not a man who dismisses feelings. So he softens his position. She continues. He softens further. Eventually the position is gone and he has apologized for having held it. She is calm. He is confused. Not angry, confused. Because he still doesn't know whether he was wrong. The reframe that reorganizes everything. He was not confused because the situation was genuinely unclear. He was confused because the dynamic was engineered to produce confusion in men who are too responsible to dismiss emotional experience as irrelevant. His responsibility was the lever. His strength, the patience, the willingness to take accountability, the refusal to fight dirty, became the mechanism of his own erosion. And the devastation of that recognition, when it finally arrives, is unlike anything external pressure has ever produced. Here is the layer beneath the mechanism, and it is the most important thing in this entire video. The strong man who erodes inside this dynamic does not erode because he was weak. He erodes because he was capable, specifically capable of the qualities that the dynamic requires as raw material: emotional intelligence, accountability, patience, and the genuine willingness to examine himself rather than deflect. Those qualities are not flaws. In the context of healthy relationships, they are precisely what makes depth possible. In the context of this dynamic, they are the entry points through which the erosion travels. His accountability is used to make every interaction his fault to correct. His patience is used to extend the cycle indefinitely. His emotional intelligence is used to ensure he understands exactly what her experience is, even as it is reframed away from what actually happened. His willingness to examine himself is used to turn his own introspection against his own perception. The strong man doesn't lose to a force greater than his own. He loses to a dynamic that converted his greatest qualities into the instruments of his undoing. This is the line that divides opinion, but holds under examination. A woman who consistently reframes a strong man's clarity as cruelty, his silence as abandonment, his boundaries as neglect, is not always doing so consciously. The most erosive dynamics are often entirely unconscious. But the damage they produce is identical regardless of intent. A man whose self-trust has been systematically undermined does not function differently depending on whether the undermining was deliberate. Picture a man 1 year into a relationship that changed him. He looks at a photograph from before, not with nostalgia, but with the disorienting recognition of a man who no longer fully inhabits the version of himself in the image. The man in the photograph has a quality in his posture, his eyes, his entire physical presence, a settledness that is currently absent. He cannot remember exactly when it left. He is not broken. He is emptied. The particular hollowness of a man who spent a year pouring himself into the project of being acceptable to someone who kept moving the definition. You cannot rebuild a man who doesn't yet know what was taken from him. That is the most dangerous part of this dynamic. Not the erosion itself. Erosion can be reversed. The danger is the absence of clarity about what happened. The man who leaves this relationship believing he failed it will carry that failure into the next one, and the next, making the same adjustments that produce the same emptiness. The recognition, clear, named, without self-pity, is the beginning of the only recovery that lasts. The shift begins with a single act of clarity that most men in this position resist because it feels uncomfortably close to blame. The act is this: naming what happened accurately, without softening it into something more comfortable. Not we had communication problems. Not we weren't compatible. Not the careful, mutual failure language that spreads the responsibility evenly and lets him continue believing that his adjustments were reasonable responses to legitimate feedback. The accurate name is: his self-trust was systematically undermined by a dynamic that used his own accountability against him. And he allowed it to continue because his willingness to take responsibility was greater than his ability to recognize when responsibility was being weaponized. That naming is not self-pity. It is not an accusation. It is a diagnosis. And without a correct diagnosis, the same condition will recur in a different setting with a different face. The man who makes this shift returns to something specific, his own perception. Not arrogance, perception. The quiet confidence in his own read of a situation that existed before the relationship trained it out of him. The willingness to trust what he directly observed rather than the reframed version of it he was handed. A man who trusts his own perception is not a man who can be dismantled through reframing. He can be challenged. He can update his understanding when evidence genuinely warrants it. But he cannot be made to doubt what he clearly saw. Contrast the man before and after this shift. Before, he monitors her emotional temperature before deciding how to be. After, he decides how to be and lets her temperature respond to that. Before, he spends energy closing a gap that never closes. After, he recognizes that gap as a feature, not a problem to solve. If this is reaching you in a place that is more specific than general, if you can feel the shape of your own experience in what's being described, stay with that recognition. Because what follows requires you to have named the pattern before you can be warned about what happens if you don't. The warning is not about her. It is about what a man who has been through this dynamic carries forward if he doesn't fully understand what occurred. The most common outcome, the one that costs the most, is the man who exits the relationship depleted, misdiagnoses the depletion as his own failure, and enters the next relationship carrying the adjusted, managed, self-editing version of himself that the previous dynamic required. He has essentially been trained to operate in a diminished way and doesn't recognize that the training was the damage. That man enters the next relationship already hollowed, already monitoring, already running himself through approval filters that were installed by someone who is no longer present. He is, without intending it, offering the new relationship a lesser version of himself, and he cannot understand why that relationship also fails to produce the connection he hoped for. He kept the prison after he left the prisoner. That is the cost of misdiagnosis. Picture a man 2 years out from the relationship that consumed him. He is with someone new. She is genuinely different, warmer, more direct, less interested in reframing his behavior as evidence against him. But he still flinches when she goes quiet. He still edits before he speaks. He still checks her expression before he commits to an opinion. She doesn't understand why. He doesn't understand why. The reason is that the man sitting across from her is not fully present. He is partly still in the previous relationship, still managing a dynamic that ended 2 years ago. The lesson is not that strong men shouldn't love or shouldn't invest. It is that a man must recognize when a relationship is consuming his identity rather than engaging it, and he must be willing to name that clearly before the erosion reaches the parts of him that allow him to see it happening. What becomes possible when he does that, when he names it, recovers his self-trust, and enters the next chapter as the version of himself that existed before the consumption, is not guaranteed to produce a different relationship outcome. But it guarantees a different man in the relationship. And that difference is everything. This is the full picture, assembled without comfort. The strongest men carry the deepest wounds from this particular kind of relationship, not because their strength failed them, but because their strength was the specific quality the dynamic required to function. Their patience extended the cycle. Their accountability absorbed responsibility that was never theirs. Their emotional intelligence made them exquisitely capable of understanding the experience that was being used to undermine them. They were dismantled by the very qualities that made them worth knowing. And the dismantling left no marks that anyone outside the relationship could see, which meant that no one outside the relationship could confirm that something real had happened. They were left alone with damage that looked, from a distance, like ordinary heartbreak. It was not ordinary heartbreak. It was the particular, precise, difficult-to-name loss of a man's relationship with his own certainty. And that loss, if not correctly diagnosed, follows him into every subsequent connection, every future version of himself, every relationship where he shows up already diminished and doesn't know why. The strongest men don't get destroyed by the world. They get destroyed by the one place they decided to be unguarded, and left carrying a wound they were never given the language to name. If this channel has been handing you that language, clarity for things you experienced but couldn't describe, subscribe. This is what this channel was built to do, and more precision is coming. If you know a man who walked into a relationship as one version of himself and came out as something quieter, smaller, less certain, share this with him. Not as an explanation he has to accept. As a mirror he can look into and decide for himself whether what he sees is accurate. Leave a comment with this. What did you give up inside a relationship that you haven't fully reclaimed? And do you know yet what it was? Because that answer, honest, specific, without the softening of comfortable language, is the beginning of every recovery that actually holds. The world tested your strength and you stood. She found the one door you left open, and you didn't know it was a door until you were already on the other side of it.